Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. In today's episode, I want to talk about grief. Not necessarily grief after someone dies, although I do want to start there because I don't think we do grief particularly well in our culture, even when someone has died. When someone dies, we at least recognize that experience as grief. We understand that something has been lost. We have funerals, people bring food, people check in. Now, more workplaces offer bereavement leave, which I think is a good thing. We've at least recognized that somebody probably shouldn't have to show up for work the day after their spouse or their parent or their child dies and function as though nothing happened. But even bereavement leave tells us something about the way we think about grief. First, we decide which relationships qualify. A spouse, a parent, a child, maybe a sibling or a grandparent. But what about a close friend? What about somebody who has been more important in your life than some of the people you're biologically related to? What about an ex-partner who was a significant part of your life? There are all kinds of relationships that might not fit neatly into whatever definition a workplace has decided qualifies for bereavement leave. And then we also decide how much time you actually get. 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, whatever the policy happens to be. Obviously, a workplace has to have policies. I'm not suggesting that employers can give somebody an indefinite amount of time off because they're grieving. But I do think those policies reflect something about our larger cultural relationship with grief. We measure it. This relationship counts. This one doesn't count quite as much. This loss warrants this many days. And then your bereavement leave ends. But your grief doesn't. There's often a lot of support right after someone dies. And then everybody else's life starts going back to normal, except yours doesn't. At some point, we start asking whether someone is doing better. We talk about moving forward, moving on, getting closure. There's this expectation that grief should be going somewhere. That if we're grieving well, eventually we're going to get to the other side of it, and then our life can continue. I don't think grief works that way. I think we have a lot of ways that we bypass grief. We say things like, everything happens for a reason, or at least, or focus on the good. You can't change the past. No regrets. Some of these things might even be true. You can't change the past. That's true. But we can use something that's true to bypass grief. Because you can't change the past can mean this happened and we can't make it not have happened, which means there's no point being sad about it. Years ago, when I was working at a different job, I had a new client assigned to me. I read through her intake before our first appointment. She was a young mom with 2 small children, and her husband had died about a month earlier after a 2-year battle with cancer. So naturally, I assumed that's what had brought her into therapy. When we sat down for our first session, she started by telling me that she'd actually wanted to come to therapy for a long time. She knew she needed it, but she also said, I never felt like there was anything that justified going to therapy. She told me that after her husband died, she thought, oh, now I can go to therapy and nobody will question why I'm going. I remember being struck by that. Of course, we did talk about the death of her husband. There was grief around his illness and his death and raising 2 young children without him. But she also had years of other things stored up that she wanted to talk about long before her husband got sick. His death gave her a reason to be hurting that nobody was going to question. And I think that says something about what we recognize as grief and what we don't. There are actually a few terms around grief that I think are helpful to know because we tend to use the word grief as though it's one common experience. Disenfranchised grief is grief that isn't socially recognized or validated in the same way other grief is. There's no cultural ritual around it. People may not even recognize that you lost something. And then there's ambiguous loss, which has a more specific meaning in the grief literature. Pauline Boss developed the concept to describe losses where there's ambiguity around the presence or the absence of the person. Someone may be physically absent, but psychologically present, like when a loved one is missing. Or someone may be physically present, but psychologically absent or changed, which can happen with something like dementia. Sometimes people use the term ambiguous grief more broadly to describe grief that's difficult to define. But ambiguous loss has a more specific meaning in the literature. And that's not primarily what I'm talking about today. The grief I'm talking about today fits most clearly under disenfranchised and nonfinite grief. If we're not particularly good at making room for grief when someone has died, I think we're even less comfortable with grief around things that don't actually look like losses. Nobody died, there's no funeral. There isn't necessarily even a date you can point to and say, that's when the loss occurred. Sometimes what we're grieving is what didn't happen. Maybe it's the childhood you didn't get to have. It might be the nurturing you needed and didn't receive. Or it might be years during your childhood when there wasn't room for play. Maybe it's years spent being the peacemaker, the responsible one, or the achiever. Or maybe there wasn't enough room to figure out who you were outside of what was required of you. I think the non-finite piece becomes particularly important here because non-finite grief suggests we may encounter these losses again and again from different places in our lives. Not because we failed to heal them or grieve them, but because we couldn't have known at 20 years old what the loss would mean to us at 40 years old. We might have understood it one way when we first left home and experienced it differently when we got married. We couldn't know what it would feel like to become a parent and give our child something we didn't receive. We couldn't know what it would feel like to finally have a safe relationship and realize how much energy we used to spend trying to feel safe. And we couldn't know what it would feel like to finally play and realize how little room there was for play when we were young. The grief doesn't come back because we failed to resolve it. Sometimes we're not grieving again because something has gone wrong at all. Sometimes something in the present may finally be going right, giving us a new vantage point from which to understand what wasn't available before. I've talked in other episodes about parts of ourselves that were there, but maybe there wasn't enough room for them. We might have learned to keep certain parts of ourselves quieter. Maybe we didn't know what we wanted. Maybe we became really good at being what was needed in the environments that we grew up in. And part of the work as adults can be reclaiming that. There can be grief in that too. Grief in realizing, oh, this was part of me. And I didn't get to know this part of myself very well at all. But there are also things we can't reclaim. There are experiences we didn't get to have. Sure, we can create something different now. We can learn something now. We can have experiences now that weren't available to us before. But we can't go back and have had them then. I think this is one of the places where we tend to bypass grief. We might say, well, you can do that now. And yes, sometimes we can. But doing it now doesn't mean we didn't lose something then. If you didn't get to play as a child, yes, you can learn to play as an adult. You can have fun. You can make room for things that don't accomplish anything. But you can't go back and be a child who got to play. If you didn't receive the nurturing you needed when you were very young, you can learn to receive nurturing in adult relationships. You can do reparenting work. You can develop safe attachment. But you can't go back and be 2 years old and have had what you needed at that age. Sometimes when we recognize that, there's this push to say, okay, but there's nothing I can do about that. So why spend time thinking about it? Or don't look backward, focus on where you're going. And then there's this whole idea of no regrets. Live life with no regrets. I personally think no regrets is bullshit. I have regrets. Who doesn't have regrets? Regrets are part of life. I think having regrets means I know something now that I didn't know then. It means I've learned, I've grown, I've evolved. Regret isn't only, I wish I had done something differently. Sometimes it's, I wish something had been different for me. I wish the adults in my life had actually been functional adults. I wish I'd been protected. I wish I'd had more room just to be a kid. I wish somebody had noticed me, that I felt cherished. Those aren't necessarily things we need to reframe. Often, they're things we need to grieve. I don't think asking what might have been different means we're trying to create some alternate version of our life and live from there. Of course, we can't know what would have happened. But sometimes we need to ask the question anyway. I think there can be beauty in a question that has no answer. Sometimes we need to ask the question because the question opens the grief. And sometimes grief is where we need to go. I have a client I've worked with for a number of years who grew up with very dysfunctional parents. Both of her parents struggled with addiction. Both were emotionally immature. Her parents divorced when she was about 12. And she started using substances when she was very young, smoking pot with her mom by the time she was 13. Her own addiction eventually took her into some really difficult places. She's done a tremendous amount of work since then. I also work with her spouse. And now they have a 9-year-old son and a 9-month-old daughter. One of the things she's seen as she is raising her kids is what it looks like when adults can stay adults. Their son was a year and a half or 2 years old when we started working together. He was part of what brought them into therapy. As their son got a little bit older, like 4 or 5 years old, he would make a mistake or he'd make a choice that they didn't agree with. And when they found out, he would lie, as kids are wont to do. Initially, that was pretty devastating to them, especially for her. I think both of them had this fear in the background that their son would eventually grow up and be like them. They've said things to me over the years we've worked together, like, the teenage years are going to be so hard. I'll respond saying, well, we don't know that. The teenage years can be hard. That's true. But they don't necessarily have to be your kind of hard. Their frame of reference for adolescence includes addiction and chaos and things that are much bigger than the kind of things we expect teenagers to struggle with. So when their son made a mistake, and then especially when he lied about it, it initially felt much bigger to them than what actually had happened. We would talk about it in our session. They would talk with him about it and give him an appropriate consequence. And each of them started to realize something they hadn't considered before. Even when he made a mistake, even when he lied about it, he was still their son. They still saw him as a great kid. And he is a great kid. Great kids make mistakes. And great kids sometimes lie when they're caught. The behavior needs to be addressed. They talk with him about it. He gets appropriate consequences. As he's gotten older, he still sometimes makes a mistake or a choice that they don't approve of. And sometimes he still lies because kids do that. But what has never changed in the 9 years is how they see him. Making a mistake at 5 or 6 or 9 doesn't suddenly put him on the path his parents had lived. I think that's been especially powerful for them to see. They're seeing that children can make mistakes and the adults around them can stay adults. They can address the behavior without making the behavior the child's identity. Sure, they can be disappointed when he does something without being disappointed in who he is. They can hold a boundary, give a consequence, and remain connected to him. I think experiences like that give her a new vantage point from which to see her own childhood. Shortly after she had her daughter, she said something to me one day in our session. She said, "I'm grateful that I had such bad parents because it's helped me be a good mom." I acknowledged that she is a good mom. But then I said, some people have good moms, and that helps them be good moms. She looked at me and she said, "Jackie, you're saying I didn't have to have a bad mom to be a good mom? Like I'm just excusing my mom's bad behavior?" And I said, "Right. I think you're learning that you can be a good mom just because you love your kids." She and I have talked about that quite a bit since that session. We've talked about her experiences growing up that never should have happened, and the things that didn't happen for her that should have. And all of that significantly impacted her. I've told her multiple times, you got far more than is fair. And you didn't really need those experiences to grow the way that you have now. She didn't need everything that happened to her to recognize that there was a better way to do things with her own children, or a better way for her to live life going forward. I think that's been really important for her to experience. Experiences like this are also giving her a different view of her own childhood. And there's been a question that we've been circling around. What might have been different for me if the adults around me had been able to be functional adults? Now, we can't answer that question. We can really never know the answer to that question. We can't know who she would have been. We don't know what choices she would have made or what her adolescent and early young adult years would have looked like. We don't even know whether addiction would have become part of her story. But that doesn't mean the question itself isn't valuable. The question opens grief. Because what we do know is that she needed adults who could be functional adults, and she didn't have that. We don't have to know what would have happened differently to know that something was lost. Sometimes, though, people can be so uncomfortable with a question that we can't answer that we just shut it down, telling ourselves there's no point wondering what might have been. But maybe there is. Not because we're going to figure out the answer. Not because we're going to figure out how life could have been different. But because there is grief there to feel. And the grief is where we need to go. The tricky part is that grief doesn't work on our timeline. Part of why we want to answer those questions or move away from them is that grief is uncomfortable. We often want to know what we're supposed to do with it. What does it mean to grieve? We want to know how long it's going to last. We might want to know whether we're doing it right. And I don't think that grief gives us very satisfying answers to some of those questions. Grief takes time. But I don't even know if it's accurate to say it takes a certain amount of time, because that still makes it sound like if we give grief enough time, eventually we'll be finished with it. And I don't think that's how it works. We also don't control when grief shows up. We can understand something intellectually for years before we feel the grief that's connected to it. We can have done a lot of therapy. We can understand our childhood and even understand why we did what we did. We can have compassion for ourselves. And then something happens in our life that gives us a different view of what we lost. Maybe we become a parent. Maybe we enter a healthy relationship. Maybe our life becomes safer, or we're further into recovery. Maybe somebody treats us differently than we're used to being treated. And suddenly we feel grief. That doesn't mean the work we did before didn't work. It doesn't necessarily mean we've moved backward. Often it just means there's something available to us now that wasn't available before. I also think about that term nonfinite grief that I talked about earlier. The impact of a loss can keep revealing itself at different points in our lives. Sometimes I think we expect insight to protect us from that. We might have known the facts for years. We might have identified what should have happened or shouldn't have happened. And now we're grieving it again. Grief doesn't respond particularly well to willpower. We don't get to decide, okay, I'm ready to deal with this now, so I'm going to grieve it for the next 6 months, and then I'll be done. And we don't get to decide that we've spent enough time on this, that we're finished. Grief comes when it comes. I heard grief described years ago in a way that has stayed with me. Initially, grief can be a frequent visitor. It comes often. Sometimes it stays longer than we'd like. Sometimes we know exactly why it showed up. Other times we don't. Over time, grief becomes less a frequent visitor and more a familiar visitor. It still comes. We recognize it. And rather than immediately trying to get it out of the house, part of grief is learning to invite it in, to sit with it, engage with it, and see what it brings. Sometimes grief has a message for us. Not that we need to turn grief into something productive. It doesn't have to show up with a lesson. Sometimes the message is simply, this mattered, and I wish it had been different. And maybe that's all there is to know that day. We don't have to turn it into gratitude. We don't have to find the silver lining. We don't have to figure out what we're supposed to learn from it. Sometimes we just sit with grief. And then other times, grief may bring something else with it. It may show us not only what we lost, but something that still matters to us today. I see this come up in some of the work I do with sex addiction. I don't think this only applies to people who struggle with compulsive sexual behavior, but it's a place where I have seen it pretty clearly. Sometimes when I'm working with a male addict and we're looking at his early attachment experiences, and we already have covered the way he has learned to pursue sex, I might ask, I wonder if part of what you're pursuing through sex is nurturing that you didn't get really early in life. Because I can see how the brain sees the parallel. There's touch, there's physical closeness, there's focused attention, soothing, there's being wanted, and there's being desired. I think that piece of being desired can be particularly powerful because being desired can feel like more than somebody wanting to have sex with you. It can feel like you see me, you want me, you chose me. For this moment, I'm the person you're focused on. And if you didn't feel particularly cherished when you were very young, I can see how the brain sees the parallel. Maybe sex is where I can finally get this. Maybe if somebody desires me enough, I can finally feel what I didn't get to feel then. That doesn't mean someone is consciously thinking, I'm trying to repair an attachment wound through sex. They're not thinking that. But I think the brain can recognize something in the experience that feels similar to something it's been looking for a very long time. That can also help us understand why the sexual experience itself doesn't necessarily resolve the longing. You can have sex, you can be desired, you can have somebody focused on you. You can experience the physical closeness, and then the experience ends, and the attachment wound is still there. So the brain may think, oh, I need it again. Maybe I need more of it. I need to feel more desired. Maybe I need someone different to desire me. The parallel will never be the same thing as the original need being met. I also see that not everyone who has an early attachment wound pursues sex in a relational way. Some people pursue sex in ways that are very detached, very non-relational. I can also see how the brain sees the parallel there too. You can have some of the experiences associated with closeness without having to tolerate all of the vulnerability that comes with actually being in a relationship with somebody. You can be desired without being deeply known. You can experience touch without depending on the person touching you. And you can have someone's focused attention without building a relationship with them. And sometimes the relational piece has felt dangerous, so that's not wanted at all. So there can be different things happening at the same time. Maybe I want something that feels like closeness, and I don't necessarily know how to need you. Now, I'm not saying this explains every person who struggles with sex addiction. It doesn't. But for some people, understanding what happened very early in their lives makes the behavior start to make more sense. The flaw in this pursuit is that sex can't give us the nurturing we needed when we were very young. Adult sex can't go backward and give us attachment in infancy. Being desired as an adult cannot go backward and create the experience of being cherished as a child. Sex can be nurturing as an adult experience. It can be loving. It can be connecting. It can be pleasurable. And being desired by someone we love can matter. Those are real experiences, but they're adult experiences. They can't make it as though the early attachment wound never existed. And our partner can't give us a redo. I'll often say to clients, there was a time in our lives when it was completely developmentally appropriate for another person to organize their life around us. That's what we do with babies. If a baby is hungry, regardless the time of day or night, we get up and feed them. If they're scared, we comfort them. If they need to be held, we hold them. If they need a nap, we plan our day accordingly. Their needs take priority. Even in young toddler years, children are incredibly dependent on the adults around them. They need adults to notice them, watch over them, respond to them, protect them, soothe them, delight in them, and they need to feel cherished. But when we're 35 or 45 or 55 years old, it isn't age appropriate to say to our partner or another adult, hey, I didn't get enough nurturing when I was little. So could you organize your life around me for a while? Can my needs come before yours? Could you make me your priority, even above yourself, so I can finally get what I didn't get? We can't ask another adult to do that. And if there was an adult who agreed to that, that might be another problem. We also can't pursue enough sex to accomplish it either. This is usually where my clients will look at me and ask, okay, so what am I supposed to do? And my response is, this is where grief work comes in. You deserve to feel cherished. You deserved to have adults who noticed you. You absolutely deserve nurturing. You deserved someone to delight in you, respond to you, and make room for your needs, to even make you a top priority. And if you didn't get enough of that, there isn't a way to go backward and get it now. That's a loss. And we have to be able to grieve that loss rather than spending the rest of our lives trying to find something in the present that can make it as though the loss never happened. That doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. This is where reparenting and inner child work comes in. We can learn safe adult attachment. We can learn to receive adult forms of nurturing. We can learn what healthy dependence and interdependence looks like. And we can develop a different, healthier relationship with our sexuality. We can learn to respond differently to younger parts of ourselves. And we can build relationships where we're known and cared about, and where we can appropriately need other people. All of that can change our lives. But healing doesn't erase the wound's impact. It can't make it as though we received something we didn't receive. I think that's one reason grief is such an important part of healing. Because if we can't grieve what we can't get back, we can spend a lot of our lives trying to find a way to get it back. Through sex, through being desired, through relationships, through achievement, through having somebody finally make us the center of their world. And none of those things still go backward and change what happened. Sometimes we have to be able to say, I needed that. I deserve that. I didn't get near enough of it. And I can't go back and get it now. And just sit with that. Not immediately follow it with, but look what I have now. Or, but look how it made me stronger. Or, but I learned something from it. Not yet. Sometimes we just have to sit with it because that's the space when the grief finally has room to come in. So first, we let the loss exist. Then sometimes, I don't know how much time, grief eventually has something to ask of us in the present. I have another client I work with who likes to do a lot of outdoor things. He's very active. One thing he enjoys is cycling. One day in our session, he was describing what it was like for him to ride his bike. As he talked about it, he started describing all of the pain he was in when he rode. Not just the normal kind of muscle soreness you might expect when you're doing something physically demanding. He talked about how his seat caused him pain. His crotch area would go numb. He actually was tolerating a lot of physical discomfort while he rode, which the parallel was not lost on me. I asked him, is this just another way that you punish yourself? He's doing something he enjoys and punishing himself at the same time. He said, yeah, I think it is. We had started prior to this doing some inner child and reparenting work. And one of the things we'd been talking about was play. He didn't really get much time to play as a child. His dad owned a business, and hard work was very important in his family. Play was not. Saturdays weren't for playing. Saturdays were for going to dad's business, cleaning, doing jobs, weeding the outside, whatever needed to be done. And then Sunday was for church. There was no room for play, and play was definitely not valued. Around the same time we were working on this, he took his bike to someone called the Bike Whisperer. The guy watched him ride his bike, and then they sat down and had a conversation. And he asked him, does that feel good? My client said, no. The Bike Whisperer said, you know, you don't have to be in pain. My client told me he teared up. We had been focusing on that as well. And he knew this wasn't just about the bike. The Bike Whisperer adjusted the bike. He changed things so that my client can ride without having the seat hurt, without going numb, and without pain. As we continued the reparenting work, he started to think differently about riding his bike. He started thinking about taking his little boy with him, taking his inner child on the bike ride with him. And they weren't going to work. They weren't going to accomplish something. They weren't going to prove how much discomfort they could tolerate. They were going to play. This is one example of grief bringing us a message. The first message he had to fill was, you didn't get to play. And we don't want to rush past that. That takes some space to just feel the impact of not being able to play as a child. We don't want to immediately jump to, well, can you play now? He didn't get to play then. There were Saturdays that could have been spent riding bikes or playing with friends or doing whatever he wanted to do. And those Saturdays are gone. He doesn't get them back. And learning to play now doesn't change that. But if we can sit with that grief, if we can let it be true that he didn't get something he should have had, sometimes grief may eventually bring another question. For him, I think that question was, can you play now? Not, can you make up for all the play that you missed? He can't. Not, can you play enough now that it doesn't matter that you didn't get to play then? It will always matter. Just the question of, can you play now? That's different from bypassing grief because we're not replacing I didn't get to play with, but I can play now. We're allowing both to exist. I didn't get to play, and I can learn to play now. There may even be times when playing now brings the grief back. He may be out riding his bike, genuinely enjoying himself, and feel something about the little boy who didn't get to do this. Joy can open up grief too. That doesn't diminish the joy. Sometimes having something now shows us more clearly what it meant to not have it then. Sometimes it's still a struggle to let himself play. Sometimes he misses the punishment. The grief can say, you didn't get to play. And sometimes it can also ask, can you play now? And what does that look like? We don't have to let the second question erase the truth of the first. I talked about my client who said she was grateful she'd had such bad parents because it helped her become a good mom. Let's go back to her. She didn't need everything that happened to her to learn there was a different way to live. I think this distinction matters when we talk about bringing meaning to suffering, because we tend to look backward and try to make suffering necessary. We might think, I had to go through that to become who I am. Maybe, but we don't know that. And sometimes I think that's another way we bypass grief. Because if we decide everything that happened to me had to happen in order for me to become who I am, then maybe we don't have to fully confront the fact that some of it simply shouldn't have happened, which is where the grief is. I prefer to think about bringing meaning to suffering. Something happened. We didn't choose it. We might wish it would have been different. And because we have grieved what happened, sometimes we get to decide what we do with what we know, what we do with what we know, because we've lived through it. That's different from saying, I needed it. This client is a really good example of that. She knows what it means for a child to have adults who can't be adults. But she's seen something different with her own children. She also has a niece I've not talked about before. Her niece is much older than her 9-year-old. So in some ways, I think my client is getting an older preview of what it can mean for a young person to have a responsive adult in their life. She's seen one version of it with her 9-year-old, but she's getting another view of it through her niece. Her niece has been very responsive to what my client gives her. My client has been offering something to her niece that her niece hasn't experienced. Encouragement, support, guidance, belief in her, and acceptance of how she needs to do things. And her niece takes it in. She has grown. Recently, her niece wrote her a letter that acknowledged the impact. I think there's tremendous meaning in that. My client gets to know that she has something to give, that her experience has taught her things, and that she can be a different kind of adult for somebody else. But there's also grief sitting right beside the meaning. Because when you see what having a responsive adult can mean for a young person, there's another question that rises. What might have been different for me? And once again, we don't know. We're not going to be able to answer that question. But we can let the question open the grief. The grief of what one responsive adult can mean. And the grief of wishing we'd had that. Those can sit beside each other. There's also a boundary piece here, because if my client could rescue everybody, she would. And I remind her that she can't. She has to have her boundaries. Her priority is to take care of herself, her marriage, and her 2 kids. And then there are places where she has something to give. Her niece is one of those places. And her niece is a willing recipient. She receives what my client offers her. She uses it, and she acts from that place. I also think timing. Client had been in therapy before she started working with me. It was court-ordered therapy, but she learned things. The work she did as an adolescent mattered, and she can also look back and recognize that she learned things then that she wasn't in a place to fully apply yet. Sometimes we're given things before we can actually use them. That doesn't mean what we were given didn't matter. It just means timing matters too. And that's another reason why we can't rescue everybody. We can have something another person needs and still not be able to make them receive it. We can't manufacture someone else's readiness. So bringing meaning to suffering doesn't mean because I suffered, now I have to save everybody else from suffering. That's a really heavy assignment to give ourselves. Instead, it means I can know something because of what I've lived. I can offer something because of what I've learned. I can give where it's appropriate, where I have the capacity, and to someone who can receive it. And I can let that be meaningful without requiring it to make what happened to me okay. Her children don't have to redeem her childhood. Her niece doesn't have to redeem her childhood. The good she's doing now doesn't have to justify what happened then. Meaning doesn't erase grief. And grief doesn't erase meaning. They can sit beside each other. Just like I didn't get to play then, I didn't get to play. And can I play now? Or I didn't have the adults I needed, and I can be a responsive adult now. The second doesn't cancel the first. I think that's part of what healing gives us. Not a way to make the loss disappear. It gives us more capacity to hold what was lost alongside what we're creating now. I don't think grief ends. I think our relationship with grief changes. It may become less frequent. It may take up less space. We may become more familiar with it when it comes. But if something mattered to us, I don't think the goal should be to eventually get to a place where it no longer matters. There are things we can reclaim. We can make more room for parts of ourselves in the present. We can create experiences now that weren't available to us before. And there are things we can't get back. We can't go backward and have different parents. We can't go backward and receive the nurturing we needed when we were 2 years old. We can't go back and play on the Saturdays when we were working instead. And healing doesn't require us to pretend those things don't matter. Healing doesn't erase the impact of the wound. It can change our relationship with that impact. It can give us more choices about what we do. Now, we don't have to turn the loss into a blessing. We don't have to decide it happened for a reason. We don't have to become grateful for something that hurt us because something meaningful eventually came from it. And we don't have to find something in the present powerful enough to make the past okay. We can let ourselves know, I needed that. I deserve that. I wish I'd had that. And grief can have a place in our lives because of that. Sometimes it may come to say, that mattered. Sometimes it may remind us, I wish that had been different. And sometimes it may bring a question, can you play now? Not because play now makes up for what you didn't get. It doesn't work that way. Not because the life you build now makes what happened then okay. But because grief and living aren't opposites. We can grieve the childhood that we didn't have and enjoy our life now. We can grieve the nurturing we didn't receive and learn to receive adult forms of nurturing. Now we can grieve the adults who couldn't be adults and become responsive adults to the people in our lives. Now we can wish something had been different and still love what our life has become. Grief doesn't have to for life to continue. It comes with us, maybe, initially as a frequent visitor, sometimes as a familiar one. And when it comes, we can invite it in. We can sit with it. We can listen to what it has to say. And then we continue living, not after grief, alongside it. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.